Hello, this is Professor Umesh, and I'm going to talk about the challenges of democracy in emerging economies. The idea essentially is to share the insights with students, fellow professionals, and the society at large when it comes to this topic of democracy in emerging economies. And the whole idea which we are seeing is about democracy facing management and organizational issue is very interesting because from what I see, there are 10 challenges which emerging economies are facing when it specifically comes to dealing with democracy and how it is organized. So the first one is overcoming polarization. We are seeing polarization both in terms of how left and right are stretching apart and how citizens are also divided in terms of how they express their political opinions when it comes to the socio-economic and of course developmental agenda as well. So what we are seeing here is the rise of national and ethnocentric agenda, which is very much contextual to that country, but it is also catalyzed by technology and media. Fake news is the biggest challenge for us to develop some sort of awareness when it comes to decision making on how we choose our political representatives. So the citizens should develop macro level, that means global level insights regarding what is happening out there globally vis-a-vis micro level perspective of what is happening at city level, regional level, and of course national level, really looking into data and using it as an important perspective when it comes to make responsible decisions and certainly when it comes to elections as well. The second point which is interesting out here is the tension between globalization versus nationalism. Now, the way this issue is important is that democracy, to some extent, promised the liberalization of the markets. We saw a good amount of growth in emerging economies, but we are also seeing the rise of nationalism in terms of self reliance and countries trying to promote the the development of their own markets when it comes to protecting their economy. And of course, we are also seeing that this is complemented with rising economic inequality, and that's the reason of generation of a discontent in how democracy has marginalized some of the stakeholders who were supposed to flourish by the globalization opportunities. And also, part of that inequality is very much historic in nature. We know that from the fact that many developed economies as well as developing economies have some sort of inequality where some section of the society was historically or structurally discriminated, and to some extent the democratic state has failed to reconcile with the structured or the historic inequality which has been existing in the society. So the state has to come ahead and try to face up the facts and reconcile with its history when it comes to tackle the problem of wealth distribution and wealth inequality. The third point is effectiveness of state institutions. We are seeing that with the rise of democratic governance, of course, state needs to have much more legitimate institutions who are there to regulate and check on the power. But beyond that, we're also seeing that the institutions have become much more complex. They have become less efficient, they have become much more bureaucratic, especially when it comes to address important issues, again, to marginalized populations, but also to issues such as justice. So, effectiveness of the state institutions on how they tackle these complex mechanisms, how do they facilitate the process for citizens, is extremely important. The fourth point which we are seeing is obviously the overemphasis on economy, money crazy, and modern society. And in this case, we have seen that emerging economies have essentially imitated to some extent the neoliberal model, which we are seeing now in the coronavirus crisis. It has failed. Trickle down economics does not work, and that's the reason for rising discontent and inequality. We are seeing the rise in corporate lobbying, we are seeing a rise in corruptions. So emerging economies need to stop being obsessed with GDP, but they need to start to look at other indicators which also measure social and environmental progresses. We are completely taking out the discussion from the small business owners. We just cannot focus on big businesses who are promising to generate jobs, but we have to empower small businesses. We have to empower independent professionals out there. So we need to stop being obsessed with GDP and take a bold move in creating other indicators which can track our progress, considering that it is very much different from the developed context. The fifth is that we need to reorient and maneuver democracy, which is driven by benevolence and welfare. The idea here is not to discuss about welfare state or leftism, but the idea is essentially how can we optimize and how can we facilitate the livelihoods of marginalized section. We are living in incredible times that we have access to technology, we have access to talent. So the whole point is how do we find out credible and transparent and effective policy interventions, which is really looking out there for the benevolence and the welfare of the people. The sixth point is developing the sense of national security, not from the sovereignty perspective, but from the territorial perspective. The whole idea of national security is usually driven by the fact that you would probably have neighbors who would be probing a security risk for you. But essentially, we are seeing now in this crisis that we also are dealing with social risk, we are dealing with environmental risk, we are dealing with health risk, we are also dealing with the educational risk when it comes to access to talent. So approaching social, environmental, health, and educational issues from the national security perspective is extremely important because these are the source of competitivity, but at the same time, these are the sources which can provide the stability to emerging economies. The seventh is very crucial. It is about developing responsibility and accountability. Most of the citizens to whom I've interacted, and we know, let's even talk about common man, they have no idea about how they can hold their politicians accountable, be it at city level, be it at state level, or even at national level. We are essentially not aware about goal based political accountability. And on the other hand, we also see that the political class doesn't necessarily cares about accountability because when it comes to power, they know that they have certain privileges to them. So the whole idea about rethinking democracy is that how can we make citizens more aware about the goals and the accountability of the politicians, but at the same time rethink the prerequisites for politics. It is high time that emerging economies should think about politics being driven by ethics, rigor, and discipline, and it is directed towards a sense of public service. We also see desperate desperateness in citizens when it comes to how state can deliver justice when it comes to corruptions. So higher emphasis on ethics, higher emphasis on bringing in tough laws, higher emphasis on transparency, rethinking how do we incentivize the politics and the politicians is very much important when it comes to responsibility, but it also comes with accountability. The eighth point is reinvesting in public sector, upgrading health and education infrastructure, financial inclusion. It is high time that we need to start experiment with universal basic income. And of course, there could be many critics of that. But let us not forget that we are dealing with unexpected issues which is not even coming to our mind. We know for the fact that those who are faced with poverty, those who are faced with debt, those who are faced with lack of opportunities, go on the other strata of the society and deal with issues such as unemployment, health hazards, crime. So these all are interlinked merely by emphasizing on the fact that we need to give tax deduction and give tax deductions to big companies so that they are promoting employment is not the only hypothesis which is valid out there. So I think the emerging economies need to find out much more unorthodox solutions when it comes to experiment with universal basic income. But the idea whole out there is to give the marginalized section some sense of financial security so that they can go and look out for opportunities which will allow them to flourish their lives. The ninth point is rethinking leadership. We just cannot copy the models of leadership imitated from West. So, democratic regimes in the emerging context need to develop their own hybrid models of growth. They need to find the unorthodox solutions when it comes to fixing the problems. The idea here is to learn from the best practices from what has been implemented in different countries and try to implement that, adapt that, innovate it to your own regional and cultural context. It is highly important that we start rethinking about how we see leadership in political segment, in business sector, in social sector. We need fresh ideas, we need fresh leaders. And the last point is essentially a philosophical in nature. Democracy, as envisioned by Abraham Lincoln or Mahatma Gandhi, has still not reached the epitome as envisaged. Um, we are talking a lot about freedom, but then freedom to flourish and give opportunities to the individual has not been completely implemented because of the fact that there is rising inequality. So, the whole idea of democracy is not just limited to freedom, but it is centered around the fact that it should give every individual opportunity to grow intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually so that we can have healthy community and healthy society. We are living in incredible times where we are learning new facts about how we have been able to develop in past 50 years and how we can reflect on those learnings and think about next 50 years to come. Emerging economies need to be very cautious when it comes to just talking about growth agenda. They need to approach their challenges in much more holistic way, and they need to start looking out for innovative solutions. Thank you very much.